Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Wim Thomas. He's a Chief Energy Advisor at Shell and leads the group that is responsible for Shell's outlooks, in particular their scenario exercises. And today he's going to discuss the sky scenario, which I think is of paramount importance and interest, largely because it discusses the likelihood of meeting the Paris goals and, in particular, how that could happen, which, again, it's a scenario, and I think he'll sort of explain all of this, but it's nice to actually see some deep thought going into this. And for those of you who don't know, and I think we'll probably expand on this, but they have a pretty sophisticated suite of modeling that goes on, some really good firepower, some of which has been fed by our own PhD students in the past, so I'm proud to say that. But I think you'll see graphically a lot of the detail that goes into what they do. And with that, I'll step down. Wim, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's always a great pleasure being here in the Baker Institute. And I'm here to present our sky scenario. It's a well below 2 degrees scenario, so we meet the Paris Agreement. And very contrary to a normal way of scenarios making, which is basically looking at the issues and what drives those issues, and then actually we explore how these issues may play out over time, one way or another, and it gives a kind of framework for wider strategic thinking. This scenario is not exploratory. It is what we call a normative scenario. So really, it is a target-driven scenario. The target was we're going to meet the Paris goals. So that is a bit different than we normally make a scenario. And with that, we have also American lawyers in our company. And basically, this is your reminder that we actually cannot see the future either, so that you know that. Anyway, just a very quick introduction, say, on the scenarios. Because for most people, scenarios, forecasts are all the same, and but for us, it's really quite distinctive differently. Now, forecast is really my view of the world with my limited knowledge, and then I'm going to tell you how I think the world looks like, and then please buy that. And as soon as you do that, people's eyes start glazing over because they think, yeah, but what about this, and have you thought about that? So with the scenarios, actually we take a lot of other people in the room. I think with these scenarios, when we make them, about 2/3 are non-Shell people. They're really external experts from all over the world, because you can give all these people the same paper to read, and they come all back with a different type of interpretation of the world. And that's very important. And also, it's actually a communication tool, because it's very difficult to paint the world if it's not internalized to your head, that you actually know, okay, this is how it works, and then actually you can make it to work yourself when you want to think about your vision or your strategy there. Anyway, when you get a lot of people in the room with a lot of different opinions, you get a lot of different variations of the theme, and that becomes a bit too much. And then we have to simplify it again to a very simple story. So I'm afraid I'm going to give you a very simple story about a quite complex matter today, but when you have questions, we can go deeper and deeper and deeper as you like to unearth that. Right, so if this is really about the Paris goals. We're going to meet it. They want it to be well below 2 degrees. They preferably going to 1.5 degrees. And also they recognized, right, that there is a kind of technology transfer to be between, say, nations, and that we probably need a technological fix called carbon capture and sequestration. Because still, right, we continue emitting, and at some stage we have to take really CO2 out of the air. Now, this is actually quite a good scenario because it also addresses a few other United Nations development goals like no poverty, clean energy, and etc. So it has more in it in that sense. Now, before we actually went to this scenario, we said, okay, well, how much energy do you actually need to have a good life? And that's a great question. So on the vertical axis, you see the Human Development Index, and then on the horizontal axis, the income per capita. And you see, of course, that the US and Canada and other major resource holders are really on the right-hand side. Now, the world uses about 560 exajoules a year. About just under, 45% is for the rich West, 1.25 billion people. The rest, the 55%, is done by the other 3/4 people in the emerging economies. And if they want our lifestyle, then we need more energy. So if they choose a lifestyle like the Americans, then we need about 6 times bigger energy system. If they choose a lifestyle like the Europeans, so more to the axis there, we only need to triple the energy system. But if we would take best practice, so we take out all the waste, because a lot of energy is just going out the flue stack as heat, right? We only need to double the energy system. And that seems to be much more doable overall. Now, the blocks on the right-hand side basically shows the demand sectors. A lot of the energy transition is really focusing on the supply side of things, right? You have to give renewables instead of fossil. But really, the revolution is in the demand side. We need different type of electromotors use and change it out in the industry. The built environment, you have need zero net energy buildings. Transport, etc., needs to be done. But you see the traffic lights. I mean, red, orange, and green, and that actually is a kind of indication how easy or how difficult it is to decarbonize the sector. And I come back to that later. Right. So the energy system today and in 2070, when we need a net zero emission world, so no, say carbon neutral world. And just for the color coding, green is natural gas, red is oil, and black is coal, and then the brown stuff is the biomass. Those are important things. But basically we have an 80% fossil fuel world now, and we have to go to an 80% non-fossil fuel world by 2070. In 20 years or 50 years time, that's quite a challenge, or less than 50 years time. And you see a little bit of triangle on all this molecule stuff, right? Biomass and the fossil fuels, and that means that we need carbon capture and sequestration on all these fuels. And I'll come to the back later again what that means. So we need at least to double the energy system. Now the sky scenario is actually not on its own. We had mountains and oceans that we published in 2013 already. And these were actually quite distinctive worlds. One was more a government-driven world where, maybe the economy didn't go as fast, but it was all about social stability. It was about the elite preserving their own interests. And that was actually kind of continuation, a long continuation of the hydrocarbon system, but with bolt-on solutions like CCS. And then the ocean scenario, we postulated that governments were not so powerful. And that probably the free market would actually reign much more there. And still to deal with the climate change, they couldn't do these big mega projects financed by governments and pushed through by governments. So it was more a market-driven solution. I call this the individual renewables, right? Solar, wind, and batteries, etc. And actually, both scenarios led to, with completely different pathways and different mechanisms, led to a more or less a net zero emission world by the end of the century. But when we gave this to MIT to say, okay, what is then the outcome from the climate? The answer was, well, it's a bit above 2 degrees, so it was not good enough in that sense. And the sky scenario is actually use the best of both worlds, with mountains and oceans, and accelerate the policy actions required, and then we get actually well below 2 degrees, and that's the sky scenario. Now, sky relies on a few things to happen, and they're not there yet, but they are getting there. And one is really the incredible cost reduction of wind and solar. And you say in the North Sea now, the next auctions, they're basically subsidy-free. And pretty soon, probably we have to bid, putting money to the governments to get a license for an offshore wind farm. So it's getting completely a normal business there. Batteries, there's still a lot to go down in cost. We assume a factor 3. But actually, if these cost reductions continue, then actually in the mid-2020s, there's no cheaper way of generating electricity than actually with renewables and with battery storage. There's actually only one constraint in this scenario, and that is the biomass. So when we looked at the resource base on biomass globally, not in competition with food and other uses, that is actually limited. So for that, we always need some fossil fuels as well, fossil molecules, to fulfill the energy needs of the world. One other thing is also very prerequisite in this scenario is that it can't be a hardship scenario. A lot of Europeans think, right, I mean, we have to do some belt tightening, right, austerity measures to reach the 2 degrees world. But it doesn't really work in our view, because if it's, if you're in a continuous recession type of world, then innovation stalls, you don't build new stuff, right? It doesn't just, this cost curve doesn't come down. So it doesn't really work, at least in our model there. And if the economy overheats, everything goes fast, everyone's just doing the same thing, and again, no time for maybe the innovation required. So you need a kind of sweet spot in economic growth. So in that sense, right, this scenario is really, aiming at a better life and a healthy planet for the 9-10 billion people coming. And the rest, like geopolitics, etc., we kept the same. Now, there are a few things really required in Sky, and first of most important is actually there needs to be a price for carbon. And it does a few things. First of all, it stimulates efficiency much better. It stimulates you to choose different technologies, so substitution. And the third thing is it changes our behaviors, which is very important as well in this scenario. Then, of course, we have to change out the whole energy system, and we need CCS as a technological fix. And I come to all these issues. And land degradation is in this scenario, not large-scale reforestation. And I come to that later, what that means between that, our scenario and that. But last but not least, it all has to be underpinned by a changing consumer mindset. Because if we don't make individual choices, then it is not going to happen. And let me just say upfront that in our view, a Sky world, a 2 degrees world, is technologically possible, and it is economically affordable. And that doesn't mean it's the lowest cost scenario, but it is affordable. And that's why consumer choice is so important, because if you can afford it, right, you should buy the new stuff and bring the cost down for other people, etc. But also choices, maybe not having so many long-haul flights, or that you have more holidays near your home. All kind of things actually speak to that. For city design, it probably means more complex city design with electric mobility there, and that's again, especially in the Far East, where a lot of new cities are going to be built over the coming decades, where it's very important how they design the infrastructure. All right, let's go to the first really big step in any 2 degrees world, and that's efficiency. And most of the people don't show you the dotted line, but actually that is 40% of the problem solved if we are very, very efficient, if we're not wasting anymore the energy. But if we actually look at the global energy investments, we only spend about 13% on efficiency. So that seems to be a little bit out of balance there. More has to be done there to achieve that gain. And then actually you see where it's going to happen in the world. The blue bars is the OECD, the developed nations, and we probably will do all our economic growth with more efficiency or a different structure of the economy. While the red bars are the emerging economies, and they actually have to do it all. And that's why this technology transfer and make it affordable for CCS and other things to these emerging economies is so important. Well, so that is a small feat, 40% efficiency gains. The other one is actually deep electrification. If you want a highly efficient energy system, you will go for electrons, if you can. And also when you have electrons, you can use renewables, and that's how you can decarbonize it relatively good. So then it's actually when I introduce these sectors, the built environment, the green line, right, how far can you go? Well, we think it's probably about 95 electrification of the building sector, so you don't need the gas boilers anymore. There will always be some parts of the world, of course, doesn't work, you still need other fuels, so it's not 100%. The purple line at the bottom is transport, and you see a kind of saturation around 45% there. So yes, it's all about electric vehicles for us, passengers, for normal passenger cars. But the heavy-duty transport, trucking, shipping and aviation, they still will need molecules for a long time to go. Yes, there's of course a hydrogen pathway, but it's in our scenario actually the second half of this century. The gray line is industry, so that is a kind of more linear process. And you think that should be doable, but actually industry is quite hindered by the fact that it's very difficult to get loans by banks for efficiency projects with 10 years payback. And that is something for regulators to help there as well. Well, anyway, the red line is actually the whole energy system. So between 50 and 60%, we think if you really push all these demand sectors, these end sectors very hard, how much electrons you can use there. And then actually what it means for the total system, this is actually the carrier. So this is actually, these are the fuels we use as end consumers. That's electrons, gasoline, diesels, and all this stuff. So it's not primary energy. That's something else. Now the blue is electricity. And you can see already that we have to accelerate by a factor 3 the historical rate of build-up of electricity. That is quite a feat as well to do that. It's not just the supply side, it's the transmission side, and it's the demand side as well. And that can be quite tricky for the industry, because governments cannot ask consumers to use more electrons if the supply is not there. So you always need a systematic oversupply situation. That's not very good if you're on the supply side, because where is your margin? So it needs redesign of the electricity systems globally. It is quite a complex puzzle when you actually think about it. But it should be doable. We have done it in the past as well. So half of the energy system in the future is about with electrons, and a lot, probably 95% is, or say 90% is going to be from renewables. Now the red is crude oil, and then the light red on top is biofuels. And the dark green is natural gas, and the light green is biogas and hydrogen. So actually when you look at when we use what we call gaseous fuels or liquid fuels, okay, it is not so much a revolution, you're just going to have a different feedstock. So if you're in the refinery business, you just have to have, well, different feedstocks in that. So I would argue it is far over for IOCs or say the fossil energy companies, because we can just switch, in a sense, in this world, from one feedstock another. And then you see actually the dark gray on top, and then the biomass on top. The dark gray is coal. And people sometimes ask, okay, why is coal not phased out completely? And that is because, as you don't know the future, and it's a viable pathway for energy use, and if you assume large-scale CCS applied to fossil fuels and the biomass, you have to say that coal will probably find its place as well. How much we don't know. We try to be about one-third all, so it's a bit equitable. But actually, post-2070, most of the fossil molecules, being it naphtha or ethane or coal, is going to use as petrochemical feedstock in this scenario. So as long as you don't burn it, it doesn't count. And of course, if you're sitting on top of a big pile of coal in China, why wouldn't you use it for that purpose? So it is a bit a balance of all these kind of things. And I would say the key message is it's an exciting world for very innovative companies, to say the least. Then the enabler again, the carbon price. We really have to have that carbon price, or actually, because actually this is a world where you need high end consumer prices and low producer prices, in a sense. Why is that? Because if you don't have high end consumer prices, we are not stimulated to be more efficient or choose another technology like heat pumps or a different car. While if you have high producer prices, of course you get too much oil and gas on the market, and that doesn't work either, so that has to be pressed down. Also, there's another kind of mechanism. As the energy system moves away from the traditional fossil fuels, a lot of governments lose revenues from that fossil fuel industry. And they still need that taxable income. So actually, amazingly enough, but by the latter half of the 2020s, some renewables become already taxable for governments in one way or another. So it actually becomes a revenue stream for governments to replace that tax loss they have on the fossil fuels. And that's actually a stimulus for governments as well to actually make it happen. Now, you can also see that it's ratcheting up. Not the whole world has a high carbon price. Some people don't need it or don't choose for it. That's all fine. We look at all the countries, and some countries can go faster or slower. Some countries have more opportunities, some not. So you have to keep that in the mix. But generally speaking, we assume about $200 a ton equivalent. And that's not just, say, CCS cost. That could be the cost incurred by governments that you cannot sell your house anymore unless it is energy neutral. And all kind of other things can be as a shadow price in there. Now, is it affordable? I think so. In Europe, we already pay $200 a ton equivalent fuel taxes at the pump. So it's nothing particularly disconcerting to, at least to the Europeans. Anyway, but I just like to emphasize again how important it is to have that price mechanism as well in the model. Sorry, so in this kind of scenario, because it's underpinned by a big model, like Ken said. And if you only do, say, one part of the world where you have very strict measures, but other parts don't, then basically you just displace this fossil fuel use to other parts of the world. So actually, that's why you have to have in this scenario this ratcheting up of the NDCs, these natural determined contributions, these pledges by nations, that they actually step it up. And it has to be in steps. So in this scenario, about the leading economies start really in earnest next decade. Then you have following economies in the 30s, and then the poor nations, they probably start in 2040s. But by 2050, everyone, the whole world, has to be subscribing to a sensible policy set to achieve the 2 degrees world. Okay, then how does it actually work, net zero emissions? Because that's what I mentioned. It's not a zero-emission world. You can't do that. You still have emissions. But how does it work? Well, we start off with the fossil fuels. About 3.5 gigatons will probably continue to be used in industrial processes. Think of steel and cement making. Coal will probably still be very efficient to do that. But with CCS, right, there's no problem. About 6.5 gigatons goes into plastics and petrochemicals. So if you don't burn it, it doesn't count. And then another 6.5 gigatons goes into the air via tailpipe emissions. Now that you have to compensate with the biomass loop, that's the blue loop. And actually there, a lot of biomass, about more than 6 gigatons a year, needs to be captured and put underground. So really think about the biomass you put in power stations, or the CO2 you generate when you make biofuels. These things need to be captured and put back in the ground, and then you get this offset. Now, you will notice actually that we need more CCS on biomass, on the green stuff, than on the fossil stuff. And a lot of people always say, well, you promote CCS, or CCUS nowadays, utilization, because you want to prolong the hydrocarbon age. But actually, we need to make this technology very viable, because we need it on the biomass to take the CO2 out of the air if we want to meet the well below 2 degrees world. So, but of course, the route probably to get there is via the oil and gas industry, because they have opportunities now to kickstart that whole industry. Okay, well, so what does it mean for the temperature rise? So we know a little bit about energy, but we are not climate change specialists, so we give our data, all the stuff, to MIT and Boston. They have a fantastic world climate model, and they run for us the calculations, and they publish it as a scientific publication, and so it is what it is. And you see the mountains, oceans, they were above 2 degrees, but the blue line is sky. It is officially 1.75 degrees, so that's legally, you can call that a well below 2 degrees. Yeah, I have to be careful with American lawyers. So yes, it's well below 2 degrees. I must say, a bit to my surprise, because when we did all this modeling underpinning this, right, I would be very happy if we could have made the 2 degrees world, but this actually worked out better than we expected. And then actually, when you take nature-based solutions like large-scale reforestation, then you may even aspire to a 1.5 degrees world. So in that sense, this scenario, which we think is technological possible and economically affordable, is possible in that sense if the politics can come together and actually make it happen. Because without that framework, it will be very difficult for the industry to play its part. This is then the last few slides is to more traditional, right? Red is oil, green is natural gas, black is coal, and I come to that in more detail. So you see its peaks in the 2030s. But just before I go into more detail there, The yellow is the nuclear, and that is not going away in our world. There are a lot of emerging economies who already have said they want nuclear power generation. And also at certain latitudes of the world, right, where you don't have a lot of solar PV with battery, it's still a good idea to have a base load either via a thermal generation with CCS or with nuclear as an energy security measure. So for us, it's not going away. It's about 2.5 times more than today. And then above that, you see all the renewables, especially the biofuels and the biomass we're going to use. But that was the only resource constraint we had there. So, and then the orange is the PV solar, and above that is wind. And you see basically by 2050, it's really a renewable world is taking over. And that's purely a cost-driven world. That actually, I would say, if you step back from this scenario, if you take away the policy push, right, to accelerate things, it's very much a technology win scenario. It's just because of the innovation and the cost curves coming down, it's actually this transition will happen anyway, but we need to speed it up for a 2 degrees world. Okay, let's go a bit to the fossil fuels itself. Let's start off with coal. I mean, it seemed to have peaked in 2014 thanks to the Chinese. They are replacing a lot of their subcritical power, coal-fired power stations now with ultra-supercritical power stations, so much higher efficiency. Although they still use coal for that. It actually seems to have peaked the use. Still, there are certain nations who are going to use coal, like India, to grow their economies. So you see this long plateau coming towards us, and before it really can come down when these long life assets and being written off. So in the meantime, gas, the green line, needs to take over, first without CCS, later also with CCS. So we think the gas market will still grow very healthily till the 2030s, and then again it comes in this kind of long plateau because in a similar business of industry and power generation, and then it goes down pretty quick as well because we need to, again, to meet that goal by 2070. Oil could peak in 2025 in this scenario, and that is really driven by two things. It's an and that is electric vehicles, large uptake of electric vehicles, and at least doubling of the internal combustion engine's efficiency. This is a bit of always difficult, right? If you go for large-scale electric vehicles, why would the OEMs still pour billions of dollars into doubling the efficiency of internal combustion engines? But if you don't do that, you postpone the peak much further out there. And so in this scenario, again, it's the best of both worlds. It's an and scenario. All these measures are required. So we assume that you have a strong EV uptake, and that means 100% new sales in the leading economies by 2030, and 100% electric vehicles, or some form of electric vehicles, by 2050, mid-century, in the whole world. That's incredible ambitious, I can tell you. And those who follow Bloomberg's projections closely, they normally are heralded as the most progressive and most aggressive EV scenarios. Well, this scenario is more than 2 times faster than the Bloomberg scenario, all right, in the uptake of electric vehicles. That is what it takes to achieve this scenario. Okay, so that is then the long oil game still. Now, if you step back here and just from an energy perspective, and if you then just by 2020, that's today, and then if you go horizontally to the other side, then you see that by 2035, something like that, in the latter half of the 2030s, the world still has as much oil demand as is today. And for gas, it's 2047, something like that, 2045. So that's actually a few decades yet of that the world needs more fossil fuels while we make this transition to renewables. And people forget that. Sometimes people think, oh, well, we can stop tomorrow, but it's not the case. And actually, if it's done, you could actually expect a highly volatile price world in such scenario, because it's very difficult with such steep gradients of decline to actually keep balancing the new system. And so it could be quite, like I say, volatile. And normally in politics, politicians take advantage out there certain populist politics, because why don't you vote for me and everything will be fine again? And that actually may stall that accelerated policy action required. So it's not an easy world in that sense to achieve. However, that is really the big assumption here, is that the nations will come together and will ratchet up their pledges and actually will put policies in place to make it happen. Now, energy transitions is nothing new. We've done it before. We went from 80% renewables to 80% fossil, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Now we have to go back to 80% renewables. But the previous energy transition took about 3 generations, say 120, 150 years. And now we have to do it in 1 generation, around 50 years. That's the real challenge. Anyway, we are very, of course, optimistic, and we always like to close up with a quote from a famous person. So Mahatma Gandhi here says, "The future depends on what we do in the present, what we decide today." So with that, I would like to finish, and happy to take any questions or observations, what you like. Thank you very much.
If you have questions, if you could please line up in the aisle. I'm going to ask one, though, sort of taking host prerogative. Wim, we talked a little bit about the United States and the stance that the current administration has taken on the Paris agreements. Could you talk a little bit about what you see in the sky scenario with regard to the energy mix in the U.S. and its goals, implicit or explicit, to reduce CO2?
Right. Thank you. Yes, that's a very good question, of course. I was a bit prepared for that. What about America? And thank God we have a very good model with all these underlying countries, so no problem. And actually, so I thought, okay, what's the question, right? If the US would go out of the Paris Agreement, would it still be possible to have, say, about a 50% reduction of the global emissions by 2050, which is the immediate goal? Let me see, here's one. And so this is the global, so let's put the US in global context. And you see that there's about 5 gigatons today, there's about 15% of global emissions, and it needs to decrease to about 1 gigaton, which is then 7% of global emissions. So that's, North America is the black bar on the bottom there. So then we unpick the United States, and in 2020 here we just have the sectors, industry, buildings, power generation, transport, you can see it in there. And then the waterfall chart show, okay, where can you expect CO2 reductions in this country? Now, on the mobility side, it's really electric vehicles. I mean, if you all buy a Tesla and other things, then that should be possible in this time. But that's a bit of a question mark, right? When your CAFE standards are not being, if that's abolished, then you don't have a continuous drive as well to improve the combustion engine. That may be a bit under pressure there. Other transport in this time frame is not so big thing. But the blue bar is actually the power generation. And actually, when you look at the cost curves for power generation, it's very unlikely that the US is going to build any new coal-fired power station anymore. It will be gas, and it will be a lot of renewables, because basically that's the most cost competitive. So you could argue that the power generation is a normal economic process. Industry, well, a lot of them operate internationally, and it's in their interest to be very efficient. So that's probably also a normal competitive process that they're going to reduce CO2. Buildings, you could argue, might be a bit under pressure without government help to actually stimulate that. But still, it could well be that if it's not then reducing to 1.25 gigatons, it could then still be 2.5 gigatons. So the US will still, in my view, be able to make a significant contribution to a lower carbon world, even, so for instance, if the administration is not subscribing to the Paris Agreement anymore. Anyway, that is, of course, 2023 and 2028. There's another rounds of ratcheting up, so next administrations can always decide to come back to that. So that's, hope it answers your question. Okay, thank you.
So when you step up to the microphone, please introduce yourself. It's not a soapbox, so please take a short question from our speaker. Over here.
Thanks for Andrew Barrett. I work at an oil and gas firm downtown. Thanks very much for your talk. Can I ask about models are inherently tricky. They're going to be wrong one way or the other. about how you calibrate your assumptions that feed into this. Whether, for example, you talked about the electric vehicles and the major adoption by 2030. How do you, are you sort of goal seeking with an end target in mind to be below 2 degrees, or are you saying, we think this is a reasonable assumption for electric vehicle adoption, and how do you make sure you're not wildly optimistic or wildly pessimistic, or with politics and political adoption in various countries for a lot of these policies? How do you bracket what's reasonable?
Yeah, a very good question. So it's a modeling question, so I'll give you a bit long answer, I'm afraid. So let me first say is that we, in the way we actually model energy systems is from what we need as people, right, as an energy server. So we don't model energy itself, but the cooling degrees, heating degrees, your passenger kilometer, your ton mile, and all that stuff, your ton of cement. And that's dependent on your income levels. So, and that's so you have that first step. Then that need has to be either fulfilled with electrons or molecules. That's a consumer choice with all the incentives for taxation and all that stuff. And then we have the producer choice, right? How you're going to deliver that electron or that molecule, and again with all the economics attached to that. So, so that's the overall framework. And then actually, well, how fast can new technologies diffuse? That there are empirical models for that, because in history it's shown that, for instance, that from the laboratory to actually, say, the startup, the entrepreneur phase could take 20, 30 years. And then it's another 20, 30 years before it actually reaches natural market share. So these kind of things are in the model. But then we go, say, more deeper, and for instance, for electric vehicles, we have looked very much, okay, well, what is a reasonable ramp up from OEMs to actually change their platforms, and how much can they ramp up the production, how many cars can be produced realistically. So, you know, is there enough cobalt or lithium in the world, the kind of questions attached to that. So we go in then much more deeper aspects to say, okay, is this a reasonable assumption? But in the end, they are assumptions, and we're quite open. If you go to our website, probably most of them are there, the important ones. And then, okay, the model starts churning, but then there's another check as basically if it's affordable. So if, I think in oil terms, if I remember well, if it stays around 1-2% of GDP, no problem. If it's 4%, well, not comfortable. And 6%, no, you get a recession in the past. So, I mean, so then the model slows it down again because of the affordability. And if it's okay, it can run at maximum speed. And sometimes you can also, you know, have a preference because the model is an energy security model, right? It always likes everything a little bit because you have higher energy security. But then by policy support or consumer preference, you know, you can push more preference to one technology to another, and then you can actually accelerate that. But within these boundaries of technology diffusion and affordability. So that's how we do that, and there's a lot of basically experts coming together and argue endlessly about the assumptions, and if the outcome then is sensible, and then change it again. So it took us a man-year to calibrate this scenario, a man-year. So there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the national energy grid, which is getting a great deal of investment and expanding. And the national energy grid I'm talking about is not electricity, but gas. So we're building huge investment in gas pipelines, and it seems to be a permanent thing. The big inch built in World War II is still in use. So, you know, the thing is that, you know, we use vastly more energy by pipeline than we do by the grid, which is getting virtually no investment. So it seems to me, how do you make, you know, our biggest, by far, investment in a national energy grid just sort of disappear in 30 years when, you know, I mean, it's being built, you know, it's growing stronger than ever. And it seems to me like this would be an incredibly difficult, you know, tanker to turn around.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good point. And actually, when you go for a more renewable energy system, you have a lot of redundancy in the system. Because I mean, I just show energy here, but if you go to the electricity system and you show the energy graph versus your capacity graph, you see that there's a lot of gas-fired power generation continue to be there, hardly doing anything, but still needs all that infrastructure as well. So we postulate that, okay, that system is built now and then actually is kept in reserve, right, when the renewables really go big time. But yeah, the energy footprint, say, on land use, etc., is going to be significantly higher. And I think a lot of people haven't realized that yet. Although in my country now, there are a lot of voices now that people don't want windmills anymore and other things either. So it will be an interesting discussion how we then achieve that. But yes, there will be a lot of redundancy of that, but as an energy security measure then for these natural grids.
Jim Tucker, geologist. Thank you for sharing your scenarios. Shell's forecasts and scenarios are always interesting. You had 3 last year. Statoil showed us 6, I think. And one thing, it looks as though there's a lot of dependency on the biomass and the carbon capture and storage, or CCS. Is the point of view that is going to happen, or do you have a reasonable way to forecast the evolution of the technology? Because I worked on CCS a few years ago, and it's hideously expensive, and we're still not very creative when we just stuff it back in the ground. Also, a comment, since policy is on the lectern. In your economic chart, it was the global south, or the developing world, that is going to really increase its energy use, and we know the population is going to increase. And it seems like governments that encourage development or provide foreign aid are going to need to orient themselves to 21st century solutions, not 19th and 20th century solutions. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think that's an important element you say there. So first one is the leapfrogging of technology. Yes, that's assumed. We don't assume really that the developing nations going for the old stuff anymore. Like maybe in the past that happened, right, when we dumped that technology there, in a sense. That can't happen in this world. The other point you made was about CCS or CCUS. Indeed, it's a huge challenge. I mean, no plant is commercial. We need 50% at least subsidy from governments. It's very difficult to get that. We had 2 projects in the UK, and both were cancelled last minute by the UK government again. And that is, it's difficult to do that. But we'll give you a kind of idea of the scale. Just for, in this scenario, the US probably has to do about 300, 400 million tons still CCS in this scenario, which is, and it should start around, 2030 till about 2070. And if you calculate it back, it's probably 1 plant a month for 40 years, which just at this part of the world. And then, of course, worldwide, there's probably 1 plant a day. So it is really an enormous challenge. But like I say, this is an end scenario. You can discuss about, okay, is it that much in this scenario? It can be 10% more or less, yes, but you cannot say, well, we're not having this part of the solution and we try to do it with something else. And really in this scenario, we try to minimize the use of CCS for the reasons you mentioned. And when you look at the whole IPCC cloud, the scenarios out there, then we are really in the bottom 10% of these scenarios actually for use of CCS. But we felt it's very difficult to reduce that. Now, if in the future we get solar fuel, so direct air capture and hydrogen from renewables, and we can then create a loop, then maybe it's different. But we didn't put that technology in this scenario. So it's all good points, and I just hope the context helps. Yeah.
I'm Steve Hart, recently retired from the oil company. Very good presentation, really appreciate it. One question I had was around the cost of carbon. You had that chart that showed we get to about $200 a ton. Does that then mean that all the steps you're talking about are roughly $200 a ton, or do you have some steps that are way higher than that on the thing? It wasn't clear to me what the $200. So was that your kind of cap you used or in all these scenarios?
Well, we use it as a kind of equivalent because there's a lot of, say, CO2 mitigation measures you can use, and it's not just CCS. It could be, you know, a mandated cost to do things up, and we actually have captured that as a kind of CO2 equivalent of $200 a ton. But if you look at the bars, I think the bottom was maybe 80 and the top is 200, and different parts of the world, different sectors could be different. And we did model that in the sense that because when you look at nation by nation, you think, well, no, they're not going to do that, or yes, or they don't have
basically
to.
What you're saying, all the steps you're talking about are roughly in that bar range.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Paul Mattingly, retiree in the oil business and author. This question may be a little different, but I would like to know, how do you view the efforts of companies like Walmart, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook to push clean energy with substantial investments, mandates for their suppliers, and political forces? Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you. Maybe the best way to answer this is an example. So at least from my own country, we have these big greenhouses, and they're really like cities. They're enormous. They're completely closed loop. So water, CO2, heat, everything is closed loop there. And next to it is this enormous Microsoft server farm. And then there you see all the windmills being built as well, or actually there. And the way these windmills are financed is because Google or Microsoft guarantee the offtake and pay the price. So that's how it's financed. And then actually the heat, the rest heat is then put in the greenhouses and vice versa and stored in the ground. It's an enormous complex. But there's quite a lot of push of these companies because there are a lot of electricity users to actually go for greener. And that actually could be quite a helpful, actually it's a quite helpful way to actually make that industry viable. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the excellent presentation. My question is sort of like specific, maybe in a different direction. Looking at the projections which you have, particularly for where you have biofuels, which will take up a lot of part of the mix, my question is a little bit more of a moral question. If you have maybe part of the some part of the world really don't have, in terms of agriculture, feeding themselves, how can you morally justify burning crops to fuel maybe cars or whatever in the OECD countries? So you'd probably have a situation where you have the energy rich, continuation of the energy rich and energy poor. So you basically have the haves and the have-nots. And so my further proposal to you would be, would it not make better sense to be that the criteria, what we should be looking at is maybe to increase agricultural production so people can feed themselves? Then you can now look at maybe this biofuels as a viable thing. Because if you put it as it is now and you're burning fuels and people are hungry, it's morally, I'd say it's morally wrong.
Yes. Now, this is a very important question, right? So the use of biomass and the use of land and the competition between food and energy. So we actually commissioned Ecofis, which is called Navigant here, I think, in the mother company, to do a worldwide study for us to say, well, what is the biomass resource base not in competition with food, or say forestry use or national parks, etc. So we were very conscious that we did not want to actually grab what actually is required for human needs. So they came up with that database, and it was peer-reviewed and all the stuff. So we just used their data. And then actually we looked at it, okay, which countries then will be main contributors. And I just so actually North America will be a main contributor, no surprise there, because a lot of land. But the other country was actually Brazil. And I was in Brazil a month ago, something like that, and I presented that. And they have about, 8-9 million barrels of biofuels potential, right, on the resource base. And they were actually quite enthusiastic about it because that would actually bring a lot of rural jobs there. It would mean that large companies will have to manage that, and they normally bring better practices. They thought that that could be regulated and therefore stop land degradation and deforestation, actually. So from their perspective, thought, oh well, if that actually is an economical viable proposition, there's a lot of things you can do better than we can do now. So two examples, but it's a very important point you made, and actually we particularly looked into that. That wouldn't be the case, well, at least on paper.
Yeah, just to follow up to the situation in Brazil, which you mentioned, one of the things we had in Brazil, we have a lot of issues with maybe some violence, is because of land. And when you have, like you said, multinational corporations coming to take probably buy up land, small landowners' land, it's sort of like it becomes a little bit murky. So I think maybe that's something which maybe you guys should maybe take a further look at, because it's a little bit of like, it's not really, it's sort of like in a thin line between you guys are trying to do good, but in terms of trying to do good, you may actually be doing further harm to maybe the environment and people who actually need those resources. Thank you.
And I think that's another very good point, that you cannot do this on yourself, right? You really have that coalition of the willing. So really, it's this governments, institutes, industry, etc. We really have to work together and decide, right? Is this the thing you want to do here? And that is actually one of also the challenges in this new system. The complexity of bringing all the stakeholders together to get a consensus that this is actually what you like to do. Yep.
Thanks for your talks. My name is Michael Bloom, and I'm a practicing civil and environmental engineer in town. My question relates to implementation. I guess I've been, for the last year or so, thinking a lot about the price of carbon and using the price signal as the main implementing approach. And the speed at which you do that and how it's different among different countries, is you can argue the details. But I'm just wondering, what does your team think about using that as the main driving force of implementing all of this?
Yeah, so our company's been very vocal in actually advocating the CO2 price, and particularly a market-driven CO2 price, so not a tax. That's the second best option for us, but we really like trading systems and all the stuff. And we already for years now are very actively lobbying for that, or asking governments to take action there, because we feel really that will give impetus to go in the right direction. So our experience so far is that actually it's not going that fast. The EU is now finally has gotten rid of all the surplus allowances, so the price has doubled recently, but still not. But actually it helps, but still has a way to go. So with China now, with the trading system, and the EU on the right way again, we'll see how that works. But we indeed, I keep saying that without that price signal, it will be very difficult for the consumer as well as the producer to do the right thing. So I agree, yeah.
Hi, my name's Dan Cohan. I'm a professor of environmental engineering here at Rice, and I guess wanted to ask a question, maybe a complement to the question that was just asked, of even if there is this carbon price, what additional role is there for mandates or government action? What actions by industries and individuals wouldn't be undertaken even with the prices that you showed that might need other government role to step in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's not an ideal world, so probably the pricing will not be good enough, so other things need to happen. It's at the moment the debate about buildings, how to decarbonize them and make net zero emissions, who's paying for that. And then you get these mandates, at least in my country, right, that there's no gas grid built anymore for new homes, and we have the electricity, you have to go to. That's a quite a forceful mandate. The other discussion is now, okay, if you want to sell your house in 10 or 20 years' time, it has to be carbon neutral. That costs us 50,000 euros to do. Okay, if the house prices goes up, then it's not a big deal if you get a financing for that. But there will probably be a lot of that kind of mandating things, like no internal combustion engine in cities anymore, like Berlin wants to do. There's a lot of these kind of, all kind of other measures and stimulus required, yeah. Andrew.
Yes, Andrew Slaughter with Deloitte. Great presentation, really enjoyed it. At the front end, you kind of solve 40% of the problem with efficiency. And I know you've obviously done a lot of thinking behind that, but in a world where energy growth is coming from emerging markets, people coming out of energy poverty, getting connected to energy supply, are they not unlikely to be in the market for the high-end, efficient air conditioning, personal mobility, lighting solutions, which we might take for granted? But the energy growth will be at the most inefficient part of our market. Did you think about that kind of thing?
Yeah, we did, and so we had a bit of an optimistic view that when emerging economies have their solar panel and the battery, that they're going to use LED lighting because that lasts longer for the same investment. Also, we have assumed indeed that the leapfrog technology, they're not going to be using the old stuff, and these kind of things really have embedded. Is it really? Is it likely that they were going to use the old stuff? I'm more worried about the maintenance of these kind of more higher technologies, because also you need a certain skill set for that. Can they actually apply it? But when you look at where a lot of these emerging economies, how low they still are in the economic development, and that actually where they use it most is actually this distributed solar electricity, which actually really up their lifestyle a lot because they have access to information and all that stuff. That is probably really an enormous step up in their better life, which is actually still very low in energy consumption, and they can still use that new technologies. But maybe that's also something then for politics to agree in the Paris Agreement, right? That we're not dumping old technology in these countries, but to actually bring the best there for a reasonable price. But yeah, assume is they will do.
Good morning. Thanks for the great presentation. My name is Ale Oktay. I am an MSF student in Houston. My question will be about your take on the IMO's regulations. They have been pretty aggressive on reducing the emissions. Now we have the IMO 2020 emissions coming up. What is your take on their goals? First they started with the ECA zone. Now we have a more broad change coming. The shipping sector seems they're not really ready for that, but do you see the goals credible?
Well, every sector has to do its bit, and also the shipping sector. And of course, because they're international, they've been pretty exempt. They use the most polluting fuels. And this is just a way of actually forcing ship owners to really clean up and think different solutions. And it may well be that they go for different fuels, like LNG, like Carnival Cruising are doing. And ultimately, also think really how they can decarbonize their system. So I think it's a very positive step from IMO to do that. But it will not be the last step required for that sector also to pull its weight in the decarbonization problem.
Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, my name is Ravi Shankar with Oxy. I have a comment and a question. I especially like the last slide that you showed of the quote from Mahatma Gandhi. You couldn't have chosen a better day to show it because today happens to be his birthday.
All right. Thank you.
And my question is, could you please give us some thoughts on your projections and scenarios related to nuclear mix?
Yeah, so when you do these very long predictions and you don't really know what really is going to happen, we don't want to discount any technology present and maybe in the future. So people will ask me, is this fission or fusion? And I say, we don't know, right? When you looked at fusion experts, it's always 50 years hence. Okay, well, it's still in the scenario period. So we've kept nuclear in as a viable technology, but we haven't really specified, what type of technology. And but per country we do, because the countries have their kind of ambition in the nuclear program. But there hasn't been that much thought, I'm afraid, in detail what type of technology is a small scale or other type. It's just there in that sense. Okay.
I suppose we can take one more.
Right, yeah, okay.
Oh, my name is George Stegmeyer. I had
long career in shell engineering and research as you did, and it was interesting to see your Shell's take, let's say, on the whole problem of energy. And several of your comments are right on. The reforestation, the idea of using better energy, of efficiency, and but there are a couple differences I think we have, and the basic difference is that governments, if you put the decision of which way we go on future energy, governments get to choose which ones work. Politicians do that. And the free enterprise system has a natural constraint. They go out and charge off in a direction, and the constraint is you go out of business if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
If you choose CO2 as being the problem, then you do all these things that we're doing to minimize the CO2. And there are broader problems of the depletion of our resources, particularly petroleum, but also metals and everything else. If we go other directions, we have to have some kind of constraint on these directions we go, because they're major expenditures that you make. You decide to use ethanol, for example, and the energy balance is wrong. You try to use carbon capture and the energy balance is wrong. It takes too much energy to put it in the ground. You don't have any place to put it. So things like that, there has to be some kind of a balance between the government decision and the free enterprise decision.
Yeah. No, that's a very fair point, and that's why we like the price signal instead of picking winners in technology. We do try a little bit, on these kind of relationships. You say, right? Okay, if the efficiency cost on CCS is too much, right? Should you think of the technology, or, for instance, right? If you have a different cut of the barrel, right? Is it still doable by the refinery sector? We do these kind of rough technical checks, but indeed, if governments would be extreme in picking winners, then it's not going to work. That's why we like the price signals much better in this type of world.
CO2 is the problem, and that we ought to be doing all these things to minimize the CO2.
Then the carbon price will be best, indeed.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Everybody join me in thanking Wim.
Good. Welcome. Good. Thank you. All right.